just to let you know right up front why I'm putting myself in that position is because by the time that you younger ones who are heading for your boss's jobs get to that position, we would have, as a nation, lost a whole group of elders who were the last people to be in the bush or be taught in the bush. So when you get that job, just think that what's been lost. Sorry, I'll deal with my nerves in a minute. I'm going to show you a brief PowerPoint, which you can read yourself, just to get you into the mood. Corporations obviously have a triple bottom line, and I'm sure that all of you coming from that field understand that the triple bottom line are people, profits and the environment. Indigenous people also have a triple bottom line, being country, culture and children. Oops, how do you go back? Is that right? Yes. The triple bottom line for Indigenous communities are children, country and culture. But how do these compare? Well, for both it's about people. For both it's about the planet. For both it's about profit. This might be hard for you to grasp. What on earth am I talking about with regard to profit with the image on the left, which is a woman who I love dearly is taking honey out of an ant mound. So for my interpretation is that the profit is culture. It is taking from the country and giving back to the country in a cultural way. Now I'd like to read something from a book which is written by Robert Lawler, Voices of the First Day. He wrote this book 18 years ago. He's an American, and as he said, he was shocked that it was so popular in the States, yet quite ignored here in this country. Robert Lawler investigates intimately the cultural lives of Aboriginal people, a culture he says has flourished for more than 100,000 years. He asks us in reading this book, which I have a copy for you to look at, to suspend our values, prejudice and Eurocentrism and step into the dreaming, to walk with our most ancient human ancestors and into the first day, literally meaning the first day, and discover a people who rejected agriculture, architecture, writing, clothing and the subjugation of animals, a lifestyle of hunting and gathering that provided abundant food of unsurpassed nutritional value, initiatic and ritual practices that hold the origins of all esoteric, yogic, magical and shamanistic traditions, a sexual and emotional life that afforded diversity and fluidity as well as marital and social stability, language whose richness of structure and vocabulary reveals new worlds of perception and comprehension, a people who valued kinship, community and the law of the dreamtime as their greatest possessions, a people balanced between the dreaming and the perceivable world, in harmony with all species and living each day as the first day. During the prehistory of Australian Aboriginal culture, the land formation of Australia changed radically. Its previous form has been named by archaeologists as Old Melanesia. At that time, approximately 20,000 BC, Australia was augmented by lands which connected it to Papua New Guinea, Java, Borneo, Sumatra and the Philippines, Taiwan and almost reaching to the coast of China. During this period, Tasmania also joined the mainland Australia. At the time of the late Pleistocene, a narrow water channel located near Timor and Bali separated Old Melanesia into Sundaland in the north and Sahuland in the south. It was during this period that the original inhabitants of Australia, who many present-day Aborigines refer to as the Mimi people, began to intermix with several distinctly different types of people, which have been identified by their skull types. One is called the Kilo Mungo race, which seems to be nearly identical to the more isolated Tasmanian Aboriginal. This Tasmanian type was called Negrito Tasmanian, and they seem to first appear in New Guinea and then moved or were moved southward to southeast Australia and what is now Victoria. During this period, the Negrito Tasmanian type, along with the original Mimi people, became one of the important root races in what was the process of becoming the diverse stock which formed the present-day Australian Aboriginals. The Mimi people are most likely to have been a pygmoid race, possibly even white, and for this reason many anthropologists and archaeologists have classified them as spirit or mythic inventions. However, the Aborigines are steadfast that these small, brilliant people were their physical predecessors in Australia. Robert Lawler worked and lived for many years with some elders who have since died in Derby and Fitzroy Crossing. As the racial contours of the Aborigines began to form in the heartland of Australia, so too they began to speak and disseminate a language which is now recognised as the Austronesian language, which has had important influences and dissemination throughout the world. Some of the Aboriginal tribes moved through northern Old Melanesia with what appears to be a rather large immigration that settled in the forested regions of India. Here they intermarried with forest pygmy race of India, along with other races moving south from Asia and Caucasia. The Australian Aborigines thus became part of a stream that formed the indigenous pre-Vedic and pre-Dravidian people of India, the Mundas and the Bihars. To give one example of the diversity within the present Australian Aboriginality, it has recently been verified that the Australian Aborigines are related to the indigenous Ainu of Japan, which is right at the very top. Later, amongst these same indigenous and Australian people of India, the Dravidian people arrived and made extensive settlements in South India. Are you keeping up? The Dravidians developed a language which absorbed thousands of words and root sounds inherited from the previous Aboriginal influences on the language of the Mundas and the Bihars. These Aboriginal influences have survived in the Dravidian languages until the present day. In approximately 3000 BC, the Dravidians became a global maritime culture, making settlements throughout Micronesia, Melanesia and South America. Traces of Aboriginal myths and rituals in this way and by other means have been disseminated throughout the world. These phases of Aboriginal culture began perhaps 60,000 years ago and lasted up to 8,000, 10,000 BC. At this time, the oceans began rising to their present levels, increased by the melting of polar glacials and ice shelves, and flooded a great part of old Melanesia, leaving the separated Indonesian island cultures we have today. Somewhere prior to this time, the tribal elders of the groups, and this is an important part of this story, that remained in Australia, began to develop legends in which previous generations were revered as having established once and for all the norms and forms of life of their group, their people, so that they might remain in the timelessness of an everlasting present. Remember, it's an isolated presence, and to live in a way that exonerates, reinforces and perpetuates those aspects of nature that are timeless and unchanging. This attitude and approach to life, this life of being isolated, is in direct contrast to the contemporary world driven to one superficial transformation after another, following advances in technology, devices and implements. The Aborigines believed that any change in what they perceived as a sacred way of life, even if it was the change of a tool or a hunting weapon or the dance steps in an age-old ritual, was fraught with danger. Within the circumscribing region of present-day Australia, within the landform that was once Old Melanesia, there survived 6 or 7 isolated tribes who hunt and forage as they did 10,000 years ago. Each of these tribes had stories which relate a philosophy and histories similar to Australian Aboriginals. That is, there were ancestors who foresaw the imminent dangers of human communities which step outside the permanent, all-abiding laws of the natural world. The tribes of Aboriginal people certainly verified an adhesion to their philosophy. In approximately 8000 BC, the Australian Aborigines neighbours on the now separate island of Indonesia began agriculture, and 5000 BC, the same regions of Southeast Asia began widespread rice civilization by a new people of the Mongolian race. None of these so-called advances set down a single route on the Australian continent, although the Australian Aborigines were undoubtedly aware of these developments. I imagine that you know about the trade that went from country to country, so the stories went. We must admit that this philosophical approach to life permitted the Aboriginal culture to persist in a vital and dynamic manner for what appears to be 60,000 years, and with more recent finds indicating a history of at least 120,000 years. This most ancient culture flourished until recently, when it was met. And I really hope that you get that within 3 years, those people that hold this knowledge will be dead. Don't mean any disrespect, no, Christian. I tried to do some research on that, actually, and I was shocked. Yeah. I asked Christopher, who should I ask? He suggested go to DIA. I asked DIA, they didn't know. I rang FATSL, Federation of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Languages. I spoke to IATSIS, Aboriginal Studies Press in Canberra, and said, look, I'm doing this presentation. I want numbers. How many, because I know from my own self in the people that I love, all the men are gone, the old men. And if you read The Age, you would have read about that just recently, the last man. In the women, there'd be, in a community of 500 people, there would be 5. That would probably be the same across the top. And these are the people who were children at settlement, and I know in the Kimberley settlement started in the 30s. I'm not sure about the other parts of the country, but it was probably before, I think. And these children were taught in the bush by their parents and grandparents, and they can tell those stories. They can still remember to a degree what was the issue about the land. That's a big long story. We can go on about that forever. Pardon?
Have their stories been recorded?
That's why I'm here to you right now and saying to you that the things that are going to happen. You've all heard about the state of Aboriginal communities, especially, well, Christopher says it's not just in the top end, but those children, the generations after the old people that are about to die are gone. They've disappeared. There's a whole big gap. It's like you can take your white-out marker and mark that across. Isn't that true? And that has been for various reasons, and I'm sure Christopher could tell you much more about that than me. So coming down the generations, like your generations are pretty much either gone or you're in a really bad way. So the young kids that are coming out of Year 12 who are passionate and fired up and energetic and want to do something with their life, they're the people that you need to help, that you need to get your CSR programs to put money towards collaboratively helping them to document the information. But there's a trick there, because you don't document it and take it away like all of the anthropologists have done and put it into the libraries, because those people don't know how to find it. So there's methods that need to be put in place about doing it appropriately. But I've got this much to do, and I'll just finish that, or I'll lose the plot, because we all get quite passionate about that, and Christopher's got to talk. In concert with widely propagated media information, films and books concerning a world flooding associated with global warming, archaeologists are now providing data that Australian Aborigines lived and flourished throughout a similar catastrophe, and that through these catastrophic experiences founded a conduct of society which furthers the stability and continuity of life. The legends and myths of the Australian Aborigines contain, this is so important, contain symbols and encoded messages that speak of similar events in the past cycles of time. Aboriginal people breathe and live earth. Does this not encourage the responsibility and necessity of recording the legends and myths of these people? That last slide. Thank you.